Well, that group that put together that news conference last week in regards to Bigfoot, that group seems to be falling apart right about now. Allegations all over the place, and one person from one of the organizations that was associated with them said that they found a rubber foot near the carcass. They believe it was a costume, and now they're throwing accusations about fraud and everything else. So it's going to be interesting to see how this thing unfolds. I'm just glad we had legitimate people like Lauren Coleman, cryptozoologist, on the program, and Mr. Moneymaker, who also gave us his insight with regards to a story that is unfolding exactly as we had felt it would over the last couple of weeks or so. But looks like allegations of everything going on between people now. So don't believe it's real. Tell you it's a hoax, and it appears that the partnership has collapsed. In a moment, Andy Lloyd joins us. We're going to be talking about the Dark Star, an incredible story. He's next on Coast to Coast AM. Andy Lloyd is a science graduate. He won a scholarship to study for a PhD in organic chemistry at the University of California, a very long-standing interest in astronomy, and he questions of the existence of Planet X or Nibiru. Andy is the author of Dark Star, The Planet X Evidence. He also recently completed a novel about the Anunnaki, which will be published in 2009. He's our guest tonight on Coast to Coast. Andy, how are you?
I'm absolutely fine, thanks, George. Great to be on your show.
Good to talk with you. And you're out there in the United Kingdom tonight. How are things there?
Well, it's 7 o'clock in the morning here, so house is still quiet, the kids are still in bed, and I'm ready to go.
I hope you're used to this lengthy program we've got, Andy.
Yeah, I think it's going to be fun. I'm really looking forward to this. I've got a lot to share with you today.
Oh, my gosh. So. This is, the subject matter on this program. People are interested in everything, but I get so many emails and messages about the existence of Planet X. Do I believe it? What do I think it is? And I'm really looking forward to getting your perspective. Tell us a little bit more about yourself than what I just read.
I've been interested in this subject for a very, very long time. I think it's fair to say that I was always a bit of a science geek when I was a kid and growing up, and I really got into planetary science, around about the time the Voyager stuff came back in the late 70s, and I was a big fan of Carl Sagan. And do you remember that show Cosmos?
Oh, sure do. Absolutely.
I was an avid viewer of that as a sort of growing up kid, and I used to absorb loads and loads of science fiction books, and I used to read loads of science books. And by the time I'd sort of got round to picking up books by Zecharia Sitchin, I was already very, very sort of, my brain was full of the solar system and how everything worked and what was going on in the planet. So I sort of sat down and read his book with very, very keen interest. I got into it. It was my subject, and I thought this man's offering a completely new idea that's come out of left field, and I really, really enjoyed that. So that's how I got onto the subject, and then I sort of ended up starting to offer my own ideas into the field because I think it needed a bit of revision, to be honest.
Yeah, Zecharia Sitchin's work hit me the same way it hit you originally when I was reading The 12th Planet. I mean, I had to digest myself in it. It was just so overwhelming to assume that we had been visited, that they wanted to mine for gold, that they created mankind in order to do that. I mean, it was an incredible theory. And then, of course, the planet. I always wondered, Andy, about the planet. As a matter of fact, I tried to give the elliptical orbit trajectories to other astronomers that would come on the show. Some were knowledgeable about Zecharia Sitchin's work, others were not. And I would tell them, I said, he said this thing comes around every 3,600 years. Here's a picture that was in his book of where he believes the orbit is. Go find it. And I don't know if any of them even searched for it or not, but they never found it, at least the way that Zecharia thought it would. When you thought about the planet Nibiru, how did that hit you? How did it strike you?
Well, the sort of the basic building blocks of what he's come up with an idea is perfectly sensible. Astronomers are a little bit like economists. You can ask 10 economists in the room their opinion on something, and they're all going to come up with the different ideas. And astronomers, although they're all grounded in the same fundamental understanding of what the solar system is like, they all have their own pet ideas about what's going on. And when you're talking about the sort of fringe of our understanding of something, then their belief systems or their what they're interested in, it fluctuates between them. So I can understand where you're coming from with that. You present this idea to a lot of astronomers, and some of them, I'm sure, 10 years ago would have just flat right said, I'm sorry, that thing is not out there.
True.
And, if it was there, we'd know about it by now. And one of the things I want to really bring through in the program today is that science has moved on from that position. It has changed over the last 10 years. There have been some major developments in the field. And the next few years actually will be a very critical period of time. But I think if you ask that same question now to scientists, even the more conservative ones on the subject of this, would probably hedge a bit. And they would say, it's possible. I don't think it's likely, but it's possible. I really don't think you get from many of them the flat no, because there is clearly a mystery going on out there, and there are clearly the potential for the discovery of lots of other objects.
Well, last hour, I just had a story of another comet being discovered, this time in an orbit around Neptune. And it's way the heck out there, and they believe it comes around now every 22,500 miles. But it just seems, Andy, that as our technology gets better, we begin to unravel some of these incredible mysteries of objects that have been out in the solar system since the beginning of time, and we're beginning to realize that they are indeed out there. It's not too far-fetched, then, to accept ideas that there are other things out there we haven't discovered that could have had an effect on this planet.
I think it's fair to say that our understanding of the solar system is about 1%. And that's a staggering thought.
That's nothing,
we have a tendency to think that, we know about all the planets surrounding us, and you sent off probes to all of them, and, you can see stars that are light years away, and you can some astronomers are capable of seeing practically to the end of the universe, And some of the problems with astronomy is that the dark stuff is, very difficult to spot. And I know it's an old metaphor, but the needle in the haystack really works, because you're looking for something, you're trying to look for needles in the haystack with the lights turned out. That's what it's like. It's one of those things that 99% of the solar system is really not very well understood. Another analogy I like to use, to just sort of put the whole thing into a little bit of context, if you imagine that you're sat outside your house on the porch on a dark night with no moon, and you're looking across at your back garden, and the back garden goes out into the field behind, and you've just got a very, very tiny light coming through the curtains of your house, and that's all that's there to illuminate the surrounding area around you. Well, the solar system is like looking on your deck underneath your feet. And what you see on your deck, that's our understanding of the solar system, the planetary zone, and a little bit just beyond it. When you look out into the garden, it's blackness. Well, that's the sort of going out towards the comet cloud, that area there. Can't really see anything at all. There might be stuff there. We know that there's stuff there because some of the comets visit us onto the deck every so often, so we know that they're coming from somewhere. And then beyond that, it's just this field, and it goes off and off and off, and it's total blackness. And then at the back of the field, you'll see a light on the hill, and that's like the nearest star, the light on the hill, right in the background. And because you can see the light on the hill, you might think, oh, well, I know what's going on in the field and what's in my garden. But we don't. We really have no idea. The only thing that we know about what's going on out there is built purely from theory. And that's really important, because theory only stands up so much until the point where you can demonstrate what's really out there. And as you say, as the scientists move forward with their technology, they're starting to find more of these objects, and the picture's starting to fill up. And what my theory is, and what I'm trying to advocate to you tonight, is that there's something big out there that's waiting to be discovered, and it's really, really exciting.
But it might not be a planet that had been, or maybe still is, inhabited. You have a problem believing, for example, that Nibiru could sustain life. I did too, because if it floated away from our sun and it was in our solar system, how could it, have that heat source? And, some people would say, well, it had its own heat source from within. I can't accept that. How about you?
That's what my position was when I read Sitchin, and I went over and over again. And Sitchin talked about there being an internal heat source on the planet Nibiru that warmed it up and created an atmosphere. And I thought, well, if there's any form of radiation from inside of the planet, it's going to frazzle life, because it would have to be very sort of strong radioactive form. And if it was a sort of a warmer heat source, then the planet's actually got to be very, very heavy. It's got to be very dense in order to create that heat. The only planets in the solar system that independently of the sun generate significant amounts of internal heat are the gas giants like Jupiter and Saturn, and even Jupiter, the most massive planet in the solar system that we're currently aware of, it only produces a surface or an air, at the temperature at the highest point of around about 90 Kelvin. It's really not very warm. So you can't sustain heat even within the gas giant. And if you had a gas giant out there, there's no surface on a gas giant, so therefore you wouldn't be able to have the possibility for life to evolve to the point where you could have the Anunnaki, people walking around, some sort of living gods walking around on a surface of a world that's warm out there. Because, frankly, what happens is, if you took the Earth and you catapulted it out of the solar system, put it beyond Pluto, then this world would quickly lose its atmosphere. The atmosphere would just freeze out onto the surface, and you would have, a couple of miles of ice. No atmosphere, just ice. Everything would just turn to ice. So that's what Nibiru would do. It would fling out beyond Pluto, and the planet would form ice. So, I sat down with Sitchin's books, and I really enjoyed them. I thought, a whole lot of this makes a real load of sense, but this is a big problem. So I came up with a solution to solve that problem.
And still accept the fact that we might have been visited?
Yes. So my dark star solution it allows you to have a habitable world in a physical sense out amongst the comets. And it works.
All right, we're going to talk about that and how it does work. Let's go back just a little bit, though. So you do accept, though, the fact that it's possible that the Anunnaki came to this planet, did what they wanted to do, whether it was mine gold or not. But do you also believe in the fact that they might have genetically created us? Is that possible?
My personal understanding of this situation is that I don't see that there's any reason why you couldn't assume that. I am an evolutionist. I accept, as most British people do, I know it's still quite controversial in America, but I accept Darwin's model of evolution. I don't have a problem with that particularly, but it's always puzzled me how humans several million years ago just suddenly came out of this primate type situation, and their intelligence just took off, their brains expanded massively. I've always had a bit of a problem with what kick-started that, and Sitchin's work makes a lot of sense. It also makes a lot of sense of our early cultures, and it makes a lot of sense of some of the teachings and the texts that have come down to us from, effectively the Bronze Age. And I generally accept his package. I think it makes a lot of sense to me. Although I'm a revisionist in terms of the understanding of Planet X, I generally accept that he's onto something. He may not have all the details right, but I think that there is something to it. And this world has been visited. So
the Adam, the Eve, could very well have been created by the Anunnaki.
That's my opinion. I mean, it's a controversial idea, and a lot of people who have real problems with that. But I personally don't really see how. I see it's quite possible idea, and as someone who's had a scientific training, I don't like to rule anything out until it can be disproven.
But even if that may be true, Andy, I don't see how, yet they do, people who believe in a divine creator, I don't see how that would negate that. If anything, to me, it augments it, regardless of who genetically manipulated us. Somebody eventually made man in his own image somewhere down the line. I mean, somebody created the Anunnaki. Someone who created the Anunnaki created them. And eventually, I think you get to the end point, don't you?
Yes, but if you accept that evolutionary principle is reasonable, then all you need is time. And I think I'm an advocate of the idea of panspermia, which is Fred Hoyle's idea some years ago.
Seeded from comets, for example.
Where you have the potential for life, it's rather like Jesus' analogy of throwing the seeds on the ground. Where the seeds land, if there's good land, then the plants will grow. If there's bad land, barren land, it won't. And the planets in the universe, and certainly in the Milky Way, because you were getting to know there's quite a few of those, those seeds land and things happen. Our sun is a new sun. It's been around just 4.5 billion years, whereas our galaxy has been around maybe 13 billion years.
Mm-hmm.
So life has had a lot longer time to evolve throughout the galaxy than it has in our back garden around here. And there are another number of reasons why I would say that Earth actually isn't particularly the ideal place for life to really get going. One of them is catastrophism. With the amount of catastrophes we had, we're sat here in amongst all these rocks that are flying around the Earth.
Oh, we've been lucky so far, haven't we?
Well, we have. And you could easily argue that what we supposed to be a linear evolution in our planet has been corrupted on a number of occasions. And I can quite imagine that there are other areas in the galaxy and in solar systems where life has given a bit of an easier ride to evolve. And in actual fact, I would advocate the idea that the dark star idea that I'm going to put forward on your show actually allows for an easier evolution than here. And I'll explain that a bit later on.
And let's assume that there were civilizations that were billions of years more advanced than we. Do you think that they could still exist that long? I mean, here we are, basically a few thousand years old in terms of who we are today. And you know what? We could go extinct in the next 1,000 years at the rate we're going and the way we kill and everything else. Do you think civilizations out there could last that long?
I think the use of the word rate is really important. We seem to be a species on fire. We don't live very long. We propagate. Our populations are expanding massively. If you extrapolated the population across the globe, then it creates a very, very crazy situation for, the next couple of hundred years. Our lifespans are short, and I think this is a very critical point. If we had longer lifespans, we had less children, then it would spread the whole thing out and you'd survive longer. A lot of our conflicts are based on the fact that we've got limited real estate and we've got a massively expanding populations. Very dangerous situation on this planet.
Some dinosaurs, before they were knocked out, went on for millions of years on this planet. But I just don't think mankind here can do that.
Well, we seem to be on speed. We're just burning everything up and we're using everything up, and it's our nature to be in control. And I don't want to be too down about it, George. I mean, I think there's some fantastic, wonderful things that we do. I'm an artist. And
Absolutely.
I'm just overwhelmed with some of the creative abilities of our species and our musical ability and our ability to cooperate and get on with each other and make things happen, and the technological advancements we've made. There are hugely positive things about our species. But at the moment, we've got this rock that we're living on and we're using all the resources up real fast, and there isn't any other option but to just get on with each other. Otherwise, as you say... If you took that scenario and painted it right across the universe, then yes, you could easily argue that intelligent civilizations appear and disappear.
Well, one of my favorite movies, Contact, where the alien was talking to Ellie, the girl played by Jodie Foster, and basically said that we are capable of such beautiful dreams or horrible nightmares, and that's us.
And that was written by Sagan, one of my
Yes, exactly.
favorite writers.
As a matter of fact, here's the line. You're an interesting species, an interesting mix. You're capable of such beautiful dreams and such horrible nightmares. I would never forget that. I mean, it was just so poignant. I mean, it said it all.
Yeah. I mean, he certainly could write. I mean, I know a lot of people in ufology have got not great things to say about Carl Sagan because he said a lot of not great things about us. But he could write. Fair play to him.
Absolutely. Absolutely indeed. Well, this work, and as soon as we make the turn here from the break, we'll begin to talk about your alternative theory and how you came to this. Is there much support for you with this theory?
Yes, I think there is. I think the Sitchinite camp is a very strong core of people who are very into this idea. And I don't know, I suppose I'm a maverick within that camp. I've tried to sort of take it off in a slightly different direction. And I think a lot of them are fairly... that they know about me at all, perhaps. They're a little bit guarded about it because, Sitchin's work is a corpus of work, and he's still writing, and he's, I've been in contact with him a few times, and he's a nice man. And, when you're coming up with something that perhaps takes things off in a different direction, it's not easy, but many of them do support me. Many of them do see the point of it and are behind me, yeah.
We'll be back in a moment with Andy Lloyd as we talk about the Dark Star. I'm George Norrie. This is Coast to Coast AM. Not a Streamlink member yet? Well, you can do so for just pennies a day. Just simply go to the coasttocoastam.com website and click the area there for Streamlink and read all about it. You get your daily podcasts and downloads, and it's also kind of fun. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you. Andy Lloyd, our guest, the Dark Star. Andy, your alternative theory, the Dark Star. Tell us about it.
Well, so we've already discussed the problems with Nibiru, but I sort of like to think that Sitchin was right that such a planet exists. I mean, from his point of view, it's the postulation. The information he gets about it comes from ancient texts, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners are aware about his work. So he looked at texts, the Babylonian text particularly, called the Enuma Elish, which sets out the Babylonian ideas about cosmology and the gods. And a lot of people say about Sitchin that, his translations were all wrong. Well, I, not so long ago, got an online translation of the Enuma Elish that had nothing to do with Sitchin, and I read through it, and I thought, well, let's just see what, if you have a look through an academic reading of it, nothing to do with him, how it comes out. And I still came away with the same messages, because Sitchin was interpreting. He was taking that work and he was saying, look, if you look at it from the point of view of seeing these names, these gods, in terms of planets, in terms of the solar system, then you can start to see this whole thing working, and you can start to see how there's a description of this rogue planet Marduk that enters the frame and changes everything and causes upheaval, and then disappears off into the void again. And I think that's a very strong argument. So why I'm saying this is because the description of this Marduk is really central. He describes it as a sort of very red, fiery object that's bright, commanding, lordly. And again, this really didn't gel with me with a planet that's just come out of the gloom.
Exactly.
We see these little comets that come out and they produce these great tails, but he wasn't really describing this. He was talking about a big red disk with lightning and halos and all kinds of stuff around it, and it brought with it these moons which were, potentially catastrophic, that this thing was flinging these moons around and causing destruction, and it sounded like a pretty major item. So I thought to myself, well, it sounds a little bit like a brown dwarf. Sounds a little bit like the thing that, I don't know if you remember back in the 80s, they talked about the possibility of an object called Nemesis.
Mm-hmm.
And there were some astronomers who were postulating back then that Nemesis was an object at the very edge of the solar system, and I mean really far out, with an orbit of like 26 million years or something like that. And it would periodically somehow fling down comets into the solar system that would cause extinction cycles. And, the dinosaurs got wiped out by such an event. So at some point during its orbit, all these things would fling down, and there would be this catastrophe. And I thought, well, if you took an object like that and you fitted that into this Nibiru idea of Sitchin's and twined the two, then you can actually explain the Anunnaki. And the reason you can explain the Anunnaki is because brown dwarfs are rather special little objects. I'm actually going to talk about a small brown dwarf, not ones that are actually a star, but a very small one.
Okay.
So a brown dwarf is, if you took Jupiter and you continue to fling more matter into it, more hydrogen and helium, and made it more and more dense, Jupiter would actually shrink. As it got more massive, it would actually shrink a little bit, and it would turn dark. And after a while, it would ignite. Do you remember seeing one of Arthur C. Clarke's films where, I can't remember which one it was now. It was one of the sequels to 2001. And the idea was that those monoliths were constructed around Jupiter. And eventually they surrounded it completely, and it ignited into a second sun.
Right.
Do you remember that?
Yes.
This is a little bit like that. I think Arthur C. Clarke got onto something there. If you did that, consider this as the monolith that's throwing mass at it, and Jupiter contracts a little bit, it eventually sparks up into life, and it becomes a brown dwarf, which is what they were talking about in that film. And what I'm advocating is that as a binary star sort of thing, out in the outer solar system, one of these objects is actually out there. And this might sound absolutely incredible to most people, But strangely enough, it's less incredible to astronomers. They're actually more... They think it's more likely than most general members of the public for reasons which I'll outline.
Yeah, they believe it's there.
Well, they don't believe it's there, but they don't rule it out. And like I said, in the last 10 years, things have moved on. If you ask somebody in the mid-90s in astronomy, is it still possible that we might have a sub-brown dwarf orbiting the sun at a reasonably good distance away amongst the comets? They just laugh their heads off, I think. But things have changed, and there have been a lot of discoveries, scientific discoveries about the outer solar system in the last 10 years that have actually made quite a lot of them right in their academic papers. You know, there's a possibility there might be something out there causing this. So that whole situation is moving in my direction. You know, I'm in a very happy situation of having put this forward about 10 years ago and sitting here and watching as science catches up, which is fun. So, should I explain how you could have life out there with it?
Mm-hmm. And I think that Arthur Clarke movie that one was 2010.
Yes, that was it. I didn't want to say 2012 because that's the number that's ticking around my head.
No, that's the one we all think about.
But I knew it was something like that. Yeah, 2010, absolutely. But it is quite a nice image, and I think that gives you an idea of this Jupiter just sparking into life and going around the sun and being a second sun. It's a very, very nice
So
image.
It's not exactly a twins from our sun, right?
Well, it wouldn't be a twin insofar as the category of star. It would be below the lowest category known, really.
So you wouldn't call it a binary star?
You could
Or
technically.
Would you? Okay.
There is this sort of crossover between planet and star, and it's a complicated business. And to be honest, it's not resolved. It's a little bit like Pluto. Yeah, the Pluto was always known as one of the planets, and then I think it was last year, wasn't it?
Where took it away.
Yeah, and this is a little bit like this. Between planets and stars, you've got this whole spectrum of different possible objects, and this sub-brown dwarf is the bit between a gas giant and a brown dwarf. And a brown dwarf is more or less a sort of bona fide star. But because they haven't found many of these sub-brown dwarfs, in fact, I don't know if they found any yet. They know they exist, but they're very difficult to find. Those objects aren't really clearly defined as to whether they're stars or not. So really, when they're born, when they're very young and they're quite bright, which they are, you know, they're very bright when they're young, they're clearly a star. And as they settle down and after a few million years and burn up some of their fuel and become effectively sort of a floating ember in space, they turn dark. And then you sort of look at them and think, well, that's not really a star anymore, that's a planet.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Because of the shape and because it's not emitting light anymore. Not
particularly, but it's rather like having a fire in a grill that's gone out. And it's still a bit hot, and you can still see a little bit of spark.
Without the embers?
Yes.
Okay.
And that's how I think this thing would look. And that's why it fits in with the Enuma Elish.
Does it have any glow at all to it?
I think so.
Okay.
The thing is, it's difficult to establish exactly what it would look like because we haven't looked at any. And it's still a theoretical item. So until astronomers actually spot these things, old sub-brown dwarfs, and can start to say, you know, they've got these properties X, Y, and Z, it's difficult to say that absolutely fits in with Sitchin. One thing I do know, and which fits in with Sitchin, is that its colour would be somewhere between red and sort of purple and magenta, and it would be sort of cloudy and dark and smoky. I'm pretty sure of that. And, you know, that fits the bill with the Enuma Elish. And the other thing about brown dwarfs is they tend to surprise us. They can emit a lot of radiation. They can, have bursts of peak where they're releasing...
Would it have had a heat source for Nibiru?
Well, this is it. This is exactly the thing. So this moves me on to the next point, which is you might not necessarily want to sit on top of a brown dwarf. You know, the upper atmosphere would be a pretty ghastly place to be, I would think. But it's got moons, and the moons are going to be warmed by it, and they're going to be warmed by it in several ways. One of them is they're going to be pretty close to it because it's small, so they're going to be warmed by the heat coming from it. Secondly, like you played Santana earlier on.
Yes.
Europa.
Europa it is.
Yes. Now, Europa is this fascinating moon that orbits Jupiter that is internally warmed by its proximity to the gas giant Jupiter. So just by being next to it, it's got this tidal forces that kind of wrench the inside of the planet as it moves around and creates the internal heat. And that allows oceans to exist on Europa underneath a crust of solid ice.
And I think they may be surprised. It may not be as deep as they think, the ice.
That's possible, but we know that Io, which is the moon closer to Jupiter, is just an inferno.
Yes.
It's all this volcanical activity because it's just absolutely caught in this gravitational wave of Jupiter. And Callisto and Ganymede, a bit further out, are also candidates for having these oceans.
Right.
So if you took that scenario, these Galilean moons of Jupiter, and you went out onto a brown dwarf out in the comet clouds, and you stuck Europa out there, then I think the same thing would exist. In fact, I'd go further. Around a brown dwarf, which is denser and warmer than Jupiter, I think not only would you have those oceans, but you'd have an atmosphere. And that's where you can start to talk about life.
So Nibiru could very well be not a planet, but a moon of a dark star.
Yes.
Interesting theory.
Well,
and still do exactly what Zechariah said. Visitations, everything else.
Yes. It's the idea opens up a whole new set of possibilities, not just for Sitchin, I have to say, but for ufology.
But would this be a life, Andy, of darkness for whoever was inhabiting this moon?
I think it's fair to say that there isn't going to be an extraordinary amount of light coming out of this brown dwarf. But the thing to realise is that the moon would be very, very close to it. Now, we sit back away from our sun, and we're sort of 100 million miles away from the sun. And the moon and the sun itself is 1 million miles across. And we see it up in the sky, and it's about an inch across as you look at it with your hand stretched out in front of you. And it's an extraordinarily long way away. Now, the moon's around this dark star would be very, very close to it indeed. You know, they would be circling around it within 1 million miles. So they would be sort of a couple of orders of magnitude closer to the brown dwarf. Now that, in terms of its luminosity, would be a significant effect. So even out there, some of the reflected light from our sun off this massive disk, I mean, it would just, I can imagine that stood on the world orbiting the brown dwarf, looking up into the sky.
How big would it look if you were on this moon looking at your dark star, and let's say you could see the outline of it, for example?
Well, I think it would be enormous, George.
Would it be like as bigger than looking at a basketball at arm's length? Let's say. Okay.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, it depends on exactly what its distance would be, but it would dominate the sky. So any light coming from it is going to be significant.
Okay.
It really is going to be significant because of the proximity that you are to it.
And this moon could have water or other liquid on it.
Yes, and a surface and all of that. And I would, it sounds like I'm just throwing out speculation, but one of the things I should get across at this point is that as we've been describing, scientists is moving in this direction. They have found extrasolar planets that are brown dwarfs, and they've been able to look at those. And they looked at the fact that when they see very young ones, they've been able to spot that some of them have their own planetary systems. So we know for a fact that there are planets that form around these objects. We know that now. That's a scientific fact. And astronomers have speculated this exact point. They said, well, actually, it'd be kind of interesting. Brown dwarfs, there could be more brown dwarfs in the galaxy than there are stars, and they could actually be very good places for life to exist because they'd exist on these planetars or moons or whatever you would call them that would be going around them. So I'm not just sort of throwing out something here that's just off the top of my head, although 10 years ago it was off the top of my head. It's now established as a reasonable idea.
Did this brown dwarf, did it form in our solar system, or was it grabbed somehow?
Well, this is the other thing, and you're quite right to bring this up, George, because Zechariah Sitchin writes about it appearing amongst the planets from outer interstellar space. Now, I don't entirely accept that. I think Van Flandern, put forward... Yeah, he put forward some fairly strong criticisms at this point, and they're not unrealistic. Statistically, the probability of I'm trying to find an analogy. I guess it's a little bit like sticking a catcher in a baseball game into a field and then randomly dropping a ball from space and expecting him to catch it. Well, of course, it'd be under a crater, wouldn't he? But you get the general idea.
Yes.
The statistical likelihood of this Marduk appearing and the sun being in the perfect position to actually catch it is really, really low. I mean, statistically improbable.
And you're familiar with the work of Velikovsky, right?
Yes.
What if Velikovsky was wrong in one point where Venus was not a captured comet? Maybe this brown dwarf was captured, and maybe that's what he should have been writing about. Maybe that's what he thought he was writing about.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, a lot of the descriptions that he makes from the text that he's describing, I'd look at that and say, yeah, well, that's a dark star.
Could be, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And he reinterprets it as being something that's born out of Jupiter, and Venus is born out of Jupiter. And, of course, that doesn't make any sense either, because Venus is a rocky planet and Jupiter's a gas giant, so, the two don't correlate. But,
where would this brown dwarf be in proximity to where we are, for example?
Well, here we go. You see, this is where it starts to get a little bit more complicated again, because the 3,600-year thing, yes, it's possible that there could be something moving around that I'm talking about, that I'm describing during that orbital period. But as time goes on, that orbital period appears to be getting too short because it's not far enough away. And I would set this thing further back than Sitchin would.
So in not 3,600 years, maybe 5, maybe 10, something like that.
Yeah, in the tens. Because the path that it appears to be taking to describe the scientific discoveries that are advocating it place it further back.
How close would it have gotten to us during this era that Sitchin has written about because of his interpretation of the Sumerian texts?
Well, I think it's probably fairly accurate. It probably at one point came through the solar system. The reason I say that is because I don't think it was a captured object. Okay, because I've established that. I don't think it was a captured object.
All right, so let's rule that out.
Stars aren't necessarily, or even very often, formed individually. They tend to arise within stellar nurseries, and you can see lots of pictures on the web that show these nebula with these stars formed. And the binary stars and multiple star systems are the norm. Individual stars are quite rare, and as we discover more about these brown dwarfs, that becomes increasingly so.
It's almost like a nest of them, isn't it?
Yes. So I would advocate the idea that the sun was born with one or possibly more of these objects in attendance, and that they basically started off in a fairly loose orbit, maybe sort of 1,000 times further away from the sun than the Earth is. And because when you get an object out into that kind of distance, it's fairly loosely bound to the sun, and its orbit can fluctuate. And it can go around the sun, like the comets do in the Oort cloud, and then some of them come in towards us to the sun periodically. And at some point in the past, it did that. Its orbit got shifted, it moved through the solar system, and that's when it caused the problems that Sitchin described. But I don't think it does that every 3,600 years. If it did, I don't think we'd be here, to be honest.
Now, the individuals, the Anunnaki, that were on this moon of this brown dwarf system, he talks about the fact that, they have this ability to get to our planet. I'm not sure. Was Sitchin thinking about it in common propulsion systems? Because I still think if anyone's going to travel great distances, they have gone through wormholes or they've learned how to bend space and time somehow.
I don't think you need to do that here. Stanton Friedman's just written a really, really, really good book about science and ufology.
Yes, we just had him on last week.
Oh, great, that's good. One of the chapters in his book, brilliant book, Stan, good work. One of the chapters in his book describes how nuclear engines could be used with spacecraft to send them very long distances.
Hey, Andy, hold on. We're at the top of the hour. We're going to come right back with you in just a few moments, okay? We'll be back. Fascinating discussion tonight with Andy Lloyd, the Dark Star. Back with more of his theories on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. Andy Lloyd with us. Andy, back to your thoughts and series. Have you had a chance to talk with Zecharia Sitchin about your proposals?
I've written to him, and we've had some correspondence down the years. He's not an email fan. I don't know if you've ever picked that up.
Yeah, no, I have. He's and he's getting up there in age.
Yeah, and I tend to do everything by email. And because I live in Britain and he lives in New York, it's not easy to go and exactly jet over and see him. In fact, my editor lives in New York. Hi, Lee. I'm sure you're listening right now, chap. And ideally, love to go over there, but I'm not a big fan of flying, I'm afraid. So the opportunity to be in contact with Zechariah has not been great, but we've exchanged letters, and he's always interested to hear what I have to say about various things. And if I come across something that I know will interest him, I send it along. And when I have put the brown dwarf idea to him, he says, well, he's paraphrasing him, I suppose. He says, well, maybe it is. He says, but it doesn't make a huge amount of difference because it's a planet. It's a planet, From his point of view, he's really just trying to establish the fact that there is this Planet X type of object, this 12th planet, that is moving through the solar system periodically and bringing to us the gods. And he's concentrating very much on what's going on when they arrive and when they're here. So yes, I think he's open-minded about it, and
it really doesn't slap his theories down.
Not particularly, no. I mean, it's like it's adding something onto it that creates a bit of more scientific context. And I'm still a fan of his, and I still enjoy his books. And
it might make it more possible.
Yeah, absolutely. This is what I've been trying to argue, but. As the years have gone on, when I first put this forward in 1999, it sort of, people listened to it and they thought about it. And as I noticed, as the years went on, Planet X and a brown dwarf on the internet just became interchangeable phrases.
Yes.
And so you could sense that, and I don't think anyone realized where it come from. It just kind of happened. So Sitchinites would say, well, this isn't what Mr. Sitchin's saying. And it all kind of just got into the soup. And the Planet X soup is a soup. I mean, I'm sure you're aware of that as well. There's all kinds of stuff gets chucked into the Planet
Andy,
X.
you know how people would love for the Loch Ness Monster to be a plesiosaur, a dinosaur, as opposed to an eel or a huge seal or something like that. People want it to be romantic. They want it to be something, mystical. A dinosaur is that. I think in your case, too, it's the same. What you're battling, and you can very well be right, is with Sitchin's theory, which is very similar to yours in terms of being close. He's talking about a planet by itself. You are, too, but it sounds like it's a planet. I think people want it to think of it as another planet out there in the solar system that we can't find, as opposed to a brown dwarf that has a moon which acts as a planet. I think people just have their own different kinds of perceptions of stuff.
Absolutely. And I'm adding a degree of complexity onto an already complex theory.
Yes.
Which, this is the whole thing. People like stuff simple. And when science isn't like that, science is incredibly complicated and gives you a headache. And you have to work with degrees of probability rather than definite answers. And it does make the whole thing more complicated. But, when you're working with this, you're dealing with a lot of factors. You're dealing with a lot of the text that he works with and the ideas that come out of that, and then trying to amalgamate that with the scientific understanding of what's really going on. Because for Sitchin to be right, it's got to work. It's got to make sense so that, when this, and I say when because I'm absolutely convinced it's out there, when the Planet X object is discovered, it's a plausible scenario with some sort of concrete physical underpinnings. You see it, it's a planet, there's life around there, and we have to all adjust to the new reality, which is that we are not alone.
How big do you think this Nibiru, which you believe is a moon of this a brown dwarf, how big do you think it is as a moon? Well,
let's take that back just one step. The Anunnaki themselves appear to be very similar to us. They're sort of bigger versions of us, but they
or the other way around.
Well, yeah.
we are they, I guess.
We are they. We are the little guys, and they are slightly bigger than us, but they're more godlike, aspects of ourselves. So if they're capable of living on Earth reasonably comfortably, and
atmospherically and things like that,
okay, then their conditions here have to be approximately the same as the conditions on their homeworld.
I would agree with that.
Reason.
That's right.
So my understanding of this would be really, you don't have to make a great leap here. Their world has to be similar to Earth. it might be a bit bigger, it might be a bit smaller, it might be a bit denser, it might have more water or less water. The atmosphere and everything, the atmosphere is crucial. It's got to be very similar to ours. So really speaking, again, when we were talking about panspermia, I'm a great advocate of believing that life is everywhere.
Me
and
too.
It's just waiting to be found.
Yes.
And that Earth...
And it's very similar, by the way, I think.
Yeah. And the DNA, the backbone of life here, is the same backbone that you're going to get throughout the galaxy. So once life's seeded, it's a natural development for it to go through a number of strategic advancements towards life that's very similar to here. And, the human form, it's sort of handmade, really, by God, if you like, but it's the perfect pinnacle of the evolutionary process. And that process, I believe, could happen elsewhere. So humans I consider to be a model for evolutionary development throughout. So the Anunnaki would have evolved there, and they would evolve under similar conditions to here, because that's how life works. It sort of opens up like a Pandora's box, and everything just kind of clicks into place, and, it's like a flower blooming. The flowers are all the same. And once they figured out how to technologically get over here to start using our resources, because perhaps, they started to do on their planet what we're doing to ours at the moment, which is use it all up, they decided, well, let's go and visit Earth. It looks a bit of a dangerous place, but we'll give it a whirl.
Mm-hmm.
And this is how I'm sort of seeing how things are moving. Because
and let's talk about how you thought they got here, based on some of the things Stanton was writing about.
Well, Stanton's really absolutely spot on when he writes about nuclear engines on spacecraft. People forget. They tend to think of rockets as being chemically powered rockets, and that's it. You stick a great big couple of stages on the bottom of a rocket, blast it off, and then you get going.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And he argues that, for years and years and years, the scientific establishment have sort of created this myth that you can't travel any great distance using conventional means. And they say, oh, well, you send a Voyager spacecraft and it's getting out to the outer skirts of the solar system now, and it's taken 30-odd years to get there. And so how long do you think it's going to take to get to a star? It's ridiculous. And he argues against this by saying, look, the reason why it's taken 30-odd years to get out there is it's not powered. It's like a slingshot. It's been flung out of the Earth on a rocket, and then it's done a couple of moves around past planets to speed up, but there's no drive that's accelerating this thing on. And in space, there's nothing stopping you. There's no reactive force that's preventing you from accelerating. So if you can get some kind of power behind a spacecraft, you can continue to accelerate continuously. And before you know it, you're achieving extremely fast speeds, and you can travel great distances. So if you're talking about a brown dwarf in the solar system that's, let's say, as a number picked out of thin air, 1,000 times further away from the sun than we are.
Mm-hmm.
So that's 1,000 astronomical units away. If you stuck yourself on a rocket and powered it with a nuclear engine, then, you're going to get there. It might take a couple of decades, but you can do it. You can get there, and you can get back. And if this thing does sort of move closer to the sun periodically, then the journey between there and here is going to be that bit shorter. Because at the moment, I think it is at its furthest point away. It's going to be a very difficult object to get to for us right now with our current technology. And
they still probably had a much more sophisticated propulsion system, I think, than we can even imagine.
Well, funnily enough, you see, yes, I agree with you. But funny enough, that one of the things that really comes across with Sitchin's books and his descriptions of the Anunnaki is that they're almost running a scout camp on Earth.
Yes, exactly.
It's almost like they drop out of the sky in these absolutely amazing, wonderful machines. They land on Earth, and then they set up camp, and then they go right back to basics.
Yeah, we're like in outpost form or something.
Absolutely, and I can imagine that's how it would be, because if we went and colonized Mars, if Mars was a habitable environment, which it isn't particularly, but if it was a habitable environment and we went to Mars, we'd make use of the local resources, and we would somewhat return to basics in order to make things work. So that sort of makes sense. But because they're described in this way, because they're described in a fairly sort of basic way, we haven't really got, except for his idea of SHEMS, the rockets, we haven't really got much of an idea of what their technological capabilities are beyond their space flight. So it's difficult to say, really. I mean, they clearly can move around, but he doesn't, as far as I know, he doesn't describe how long it takes to get from here to Nibiru. But the general gist of it is that unless Nibiru's quite close in its orbital cycle, I would have thought it's more difficult to do. But actually saying that, George, one of the things Zechariah has written to me is that, there's no reason to suspect that the times when the Anunnaki visit us have to coincide with the appearance of the planet, which sort of startled me when I wrote that.
Well, they could be on outposts in other areas, closer by.
Absolutely. He reckons there's some on Mars, isn't he? And the Agisi, I think he called them. So from his point of view, I think he doesn't necessarily take the stand that, their great King Anu arrived just as Nibiru appeared in the sky. That's the most likely possibility, but he would argue possibly that they can come and go as they please.
What I found fascinating, too, about some of his work is when he talks about Earth collided with, other objects, and all of a sudden now scientists are saying Earth collided with another object. I mean, I find this to be very fascinating, don't you?
Well, one of the reasons I really enjoy his work. He predicts things, and it comes to be. The moon appears to have been formed from a massive collision with a Mars-sized object very early on in the solar system. And, there you go.
And it's either part of Earth or part of both, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. His contention, of course, was that Earth was created from a very destructive collision between one of the moons of Nibiru, or Marduk. I mean, I like to call Marduk the Dark Star because I think that makes sense.
Right.
So in the Babylonian sense, it's one of the moons of Marduk, because the term Nibiru it's a little bit more complicated because it's one of the 49 names, I think it is, that's given to Marduk. And I think it's generally used in terms of a ferry or the ferryman, and it's generally used in terms of being seen in the sky. So this is why I think there's a certain amount of flexibility as to what Nibiru is.
Well, and how many moons is this brown dwarf bringing with it? Nibiru being 7. One of them.
It had 7.
7.
But this is one of the contentious things, of course, because there were all these collisions. So whether it's still got 7 or not now, but it would be a brown dwarf with 7 moons, I would put forward, just based on some of the symbolism that appears to come with it from Egypt and Mesopotamia. And you only need one of those to be life-supporting. The rest of them can just be other planets.
That's true. I mean, look at the amount of moons that Jupiter has and Saturn has. I mean, there's no reason not to believe then, if your theory's correct about this brown dwarf, that it could be carrying with it 7, maybe even more.
Well, it could also be carrying a host of asteroids, a host of its own comets. So, if it approached the solar system from even quite a wide distance, outside Neptune's orbit, for instance, that's not to say that some of its own system couldn't rub into ours. It's quite potential for quite.
Why can't astronomers find it, Andy?
That's a big question. The simple answer is these things are very, very difficult to find. Like I said earlier on with the luminosity thing, with the sat on the deck looking out at the field, that area of darkness is extensive. I've got a quote here from...
And, of course, nowadays, astronomers are finding these other planets because of wobbles and, different looks, I think, across their own star system.
Yes, they are, and those are much easier to find. So even if you're looking out a million light years away to spot these things, the point is that you're looking at a luminous object, a self-luminous object that's easy to spot and easy to measure. Whereas where you're looking for brown dwarfs, they are dark by their very nature, or at least these old objects are, and they're very difficult to spot.
It's almost like looking for a black hole, isn't it?
It is, yeah, it is. It's a little bit easier than that, but not much, because they're very powerful objects that emit X-rays, or at least there's X-rays associated with them, because they don't really emit anything, brown dwarfs, but they're powerful, energetic objects. They have a great amount of fluctuation that occurs around them, whereas brown dwarfs are just sort of gas giants floating about, Anyway, I've got a quote here from a guy from JPL, Dr. Peter Eisenhart, and it says, We believe there are more brown dwarfs than stars, but we haven't found many of them because they're too faint in visible light. Well, that's very simple, but it illustrates my point. You can find them in infrared, and you can. The best way to find one of these is to use an infrared sky survey. So IRAS went up in the mid-'80s, and I think one of the things that people don't realize about IRAS is that it wasn't actually complete. It did about 95% of the sky. They took the data, and there were lots and lots of anomalies from IRAS, and they worked through some of them, and they released some findings, and there were some controversial ideas at the time, which you've probably heard about, that were published in mainstream papers about objects that were discovered that might be Jupiter-sized planets going around the sun, which sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Sure does.
And some of those leads were actually never chased up. And one of the things I describe in Dark Star is one particular report that was a controversy between the Americans and the British on the project, because I think there were three camps, British, Americans, and I think it was the Dutch. And the English were very, very keen to chase up an anomalous finding in Sagittarius, and the Americans canned it. I don't know why. And there was a bit of public spat between them about this. But IRAS eventually ran out of funding, and they didn't really complete their work. There was lots there that could have continued, and the project came to a natural end before all the work was completed. So whenever you hear someone say, oh, well, IRAS would have found it, as with all things, it's not as simple as that. And there hasn't been another really good sky search in 25 years in the infrared, which is surprising, isn't it, really?
Is this something where maybe amateur astronomers are going to find, or they don't have that kind of equipment to find this?
They don't really, no. Because in the infrared, you can't look at stuff in the infrared from your back garden. The reason is because you're surrounded by infrared. We're living in a bubble of infrared. The Earth is a bubble of infrared. We're all surrounded by warmth. You have to put the telescopes either into the cold of space, or if you really want to stay on the Earth, you have to go to the Antarctic or other extremely cold zones where you can take out a lot of the background heat. So that's why it's difficult to work in this particular part of the electromagnetic spectrum.
Andy, take a moment and tell us where you can find the dark star.
Okay.
Go ahead.
What now?
Yeah.
Sagittarius, or thereabouts.
No, I mean your book.
Oh, I see. My apologies, George. Well, not literally the dark side. Oh, yes. You can find my book well, basically the place to go is Amazon. If you're on the internet, go and look it up on Amazon. There's a link from the Coast to Coast site, and there's a link from my Dark Star Theory website, which is darkstar1.co.uk. I've also got a phone number for people who aren't on the internet, and that's through to my publisher, Bruce Stephen Holmes at Timeless Voyager Press, and this is for people who can't order through the internet, and that's 1-800-576-5463, and I'll give that number again. That's 1-800-576-5463.
Okay, and we'll make sure Lex, our webmaster, posts it under your name on the coasttocoastam.com website. You talk about how science may be catching up with Planet X. We'll talk with you about that when we come back, Andy. Great stories coming out of the After Dark newsletter, and you get 13 issues for the price of 12, so simply go to the coasttocoastam.com website, safe and secure. You can call this toll-free number, 1-888-727-5505. And welcome back. We're with Andy Lloyd. He is the author of the book, The Dark Star, his theories on Nibiru and brown dwarfs. Andy, you said that science is catching up with Planet X. Explain that.
One of the great movements forward with science in the last 10 or 15 years has been their ability to be able to find objects at the very edge of the solar system. I'll run you through the planets real fast. We start with the Sun, we move to Mercury, Venus, to the Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. Now, those are the planets that we can see in the sky with our visible eye.
Right.
You go past Saturn, which is a very considerable distance out, really, compared to us, and you get to Uranus, and then you get up to Neptune. And Neptune's sort of the border, really the border of the solar system. Pluto moves outside the orbit of Neptune. Now, there's the asteroid belt that we know about between Mars and Jupiter, but there is a second asteroid belt, which people don't know about very much. And that second asteroid belt is located beyond Neptune, and it's called the Kuiper Belt. Well, you Americans call it the Kuiper Belt.
Or no, we call it the Kuiper Belt here.
The Kuiper Belt, I apologize. After Gerald, who would presumably be Kuiper, we call it the Edgeworth Kuiper Belt because there was a Brit who found it first, but there we go. So anyway, this belt beyond Neptune, we're just starting to find those objects. And they found the first object, I think, back in 1991 or 92. And since then, there's been this sort of avalanche of discoveries about these objects.
Were these, a planet that didn't form or a planet that blew up?
No, there just seem to be leftover fragments from the solar system. They're effectively like the asteroids between Mars and Jupiter, and it's this belt of them. And there was a theoretical model that suggested that they would be there, but it's only really in the last 10 or 15 years that we've actually been able to locate them. And more are being found all the time. Now, theoretically, they should be somewhat attached to Neptune. The planet Neptune's a big influence out in the outer solar system, and it should be a sort of shepherd to the sheep. And they're the little sheep that are going around outside it, and it sort of shepherds them along. And Pluto's the same. Pluto's sort of, Neptune's Pluto's shepherd. And the problem is that the belt isn't really as it's supposed to be. And this is very important because the theoretical underpinning of what it should look like, it doesn't work. In practice, it's not behaving itself. The objects out there, quite a few of them, are doing some really, really weird things. And some of them are in very scattered orbits. They're moving at strangely inclined orbits, or they're just not behaving themselves at all. The shepherd isn't doing the business.
Something playing with them?
Exactly. Now, astronomers have been scratching their head about this for about a decade, and each new anomaly that pops up creates more sort of data for them to try and grind, to try and figure what's going on. There is a genuine mystery here, George. I really want to put this across because this is really, really important. This isn't just me making something up off the top of my head to try and, say my theory's right or what have you. Irrespective of whether my brown dwarf idea is correct, there is something genuinely mysterious out there. They don't understand it. And if you ask 3 different astronomers, you'll get 3 different answers about what might be going on out there. So they have various ideas. One of them is that the sun passed close to another star at one point and tugged some of them out. Another idea is that Neptune migrated, it moved, and then moved back again. I mean, they're pretty wild theories, really, to try and explain these anomalies. One of them is that the solar system interacted with what are called gigantic molecular clouds. And then the fourth idea of this little run is that there is a brown dwarf out there. And that's not me, that's them. So when you actually read some of these papers, the astronomical papers, I'm not going to bore you to tears by reading them because they're heavy, and your readers aren't necessarily going to want to listen to me quote from scientific papers. But when you read them and you spot things like that, you spot things like, well, it could be a passing star or it could be a companion brown dwarf. Well, obviously, from my point of view, that really jumps out at me because 10 years ago, no one would give that idea the time of day. And now it's appearing in academic papers. So this is why science is catching up with Sitchin, or at least it's catching up with this idea of a brown dwarf.
Isn't science also mystified about Pioneers 10 and 11? Is it that seems to be changing? Something's speeding them up? They can't figure it out?
Yes. One of the scientists who's been working on this for a long time is a man called John Anderson, and he worked out at JPL for many years on the Voyager and Pioneer. And he's actually always been quite interested in the Planet X idea as a scientist. And he's been working on this on a long time, and there really isn't actually an answer to that anomaly. It's a long-standing anomaly. No one's cracked it. They've moved from, is it an object that's pulling these Pioneer spacecraft in some way, or do you need to actually change the laws of physics? It goes to that sort of extent. My argument with this is that the sun and the binary companion create a more complex gravitational system, and that the entire mass of the solar system is greater because of the addition of this brown dwarf. And if you take it as a whole, then that greater gravity of the system is going to slow down the spacecraft. That's kind of my take on this. So that's one of a number of anomalies. There are others. Do you want me to tell you about them?
Yeah, give us a few.
The problem with all this, Lark, is it's a little bit technical and it involves a bit of knowledge. So you'll have to bear with me as I work through them a little bit.
This is an extremely intelligent audience, Andy.
Good. I'm very pleased to hear that.
They all have PhDs in astronomy.
The Kuiper belt, which we've just been discussing, not only has objects that are flung around in odd ways, like Sedna and 2000 CR105 and Xena, which is now called Eris, and Makey, I think they've just named one of them, and various other anomalous objects which get people scratching their heads. But it also has a cut-off point where it should sort of, like our asteroid belts, sort of drift out and be concentrated in the middle and just sort of phase out. It stops dead around about 50 astronomical units away. This is unexpected, and it requires a bit of explanation from scientists. And they call this the truncation of the Kuiper belt and Kuiper belt, or they call it the Kuiper cliff or the Kuiper gap. They've put various labels on it. And they don't know why there's this cutoff point. Work by a physicist called Lynn Allen is the person to have a look at in terms of describing this effect. So again, various possibilities have been put forward, and one of the sort of mainstream favourites, by no means settled, is that there was a close flyby of a star which caused this truncation. But in actual fact, some work that's been done by a professor called Alice Quillen has indicated that this isn't necessarily the case. The shape of the disk is more in keeping with other disks that we see around new stars that are binary stars. So that when you compare the shape of the outer solar system with these young protoplanetary disks around young stars, you kind of have to come to the conclusion that at some point in the past, the sun was a binary system. So again, this isn't me. This is coming out of scientific papers.
So this all points that there's a number of objects somewhere out there that could be having an effect on other objects.
Yes.
In your theory, of course, it being the brown dwarf.
Exactly. Now, there's another chap who's very interested in discovering these objects called Mike Brown, and he's a professor, I think he's out of Caltech, possibly. And he's been quoted various times as saying, there might be something out there moving these things in the past. And this is what they all say. They all say at the early point in the solar system, there may well have been something moving around out beyond the sun that carved its way through the outer solar system, swept out some of these comets, can explain why there's missing comets on the Kuiper belt. And, but we don't know where it is. It should be there, but it's gone. So let's assume it's left. So that's their argument, you see, because it's a bit of a stretch to say it's still there for them, because then they have to explain why they haven't found it.
Now,
it's easy for me to say that, but not easy for them to say that.
Let me ask you about a date. You mentioned it briefly, and we'll hone in on it, 2012. I think the Mayans were onto something. I think it's a celestial event. I've said that it could be a solar event, but whatever it is, I think it's tied to some kind of celestial object that somehow the Mayans knew affected this planet. Do you think 2012 something could happen to us or to this planet?
Possibly. I wouldn't rule it out. In the context of the dark star, the scenarios that you could paint to describe it would be complicated. I wouldn't like to say it's a simple solution. My favourite solution of all of this is actually one of Maurice Cotterell's, who described quite a lot of stuff to do with the Mayans, and he was describing the sun's activity in terms of great cycles, not just the 11.5-year cycles, but in terms of great cycles. And he did some work on this and came to the conclusion that 2012 may in some way be connected with the solar cycles. And I think that may be true, and it may feed into the dark star because, if you have a sun and you have a twin that we don't know about, then the interactions between their very extensive magnetic and energetic fields may create interactions that we're just unaware of. We don't know anything about it because we don't know it's there at the moment.
How would they know about it?
how would the Mayans know about it? Well, I suppose they'd know about it in the same way that the Anunnaki knew about it.
They were told.
Well, Sitchin wrote his fourth book, I think it was. He was advocating the idea that some of the Anunnaki travelled over to the American continent and taught them all there was to know, so that the civilizations that were flowering somewhat later, received knowledge that had been passed down, which was why you had the wind gods and the returning god, like, my pronunciation is going to be bad here. Is it Colcuran? But Quetzalcoatl of the Mexicans.
That's close enough.
Yes. It's not easy working off the top of your head with this stuff, is
No,
it?
you're doing all right.
So he was advocating this idea, and Sitchin's general sort of thesis that the sort of little colony of Anunnaki spread themselves around a little bit because they started to irritate each other, and they set up little tribes of people to fight on their behalf and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it sounds very familiar because we're humans. That's what we do. He was advocating this idea that they spread out, they took over land masses for themselves, and that the knowledge was passed down. So the Mayans may well have picked up on this, and I suppose it's they were incredibly orientated around maths, weren't they, with their calendar cycles, considering that the rest of their life was fairly rural out there in the jungle, and there must be some reason why they took it to such extremes in terms of calculating these dates in these calendars. And I agree with you. When you're talking about numbers of the sort of order of magnitude of 5,000 years, all set out in days, then it's got to be significant, and it really shouldn't be something that anyone should just say, oh, well, it's a load of old New Age rubbish. There may well be something to it.
Well, we're going to be there in a few more years, Andy.
Yes. I've actually written a book that's going to come out later on this year, which is set in the last quarter of 2012, and it's my opportunity in a sort of fictional format to offer some ideas as to what might happen during that time with relation to the Mayans. But I won't go into it particularly.
But you would agree that whatever is going to happen might have already happened on this planet during this cyclical time?
It's difficult to say because the last time would have been around about the time that the Egyptians emerged. And you could look at that and you could say, well, that was a significant point in history, 3,100 BC or thereabouts. And that was a point where there was a great flowering of civilization. I would have to say, looking at that period of time was a positive period of time rather than a negative period of time, a period of growth for humanity. So if you took that as a you look back in time and you try and establish whether there was a catastrophe, which tends to be what we always concentrate on these things, that didn't seem to happen. So I would assume that there may be a change for us, but the change would be a good thing for us, not necessarily a bad thing.
Change? Well, I don't know.
I don't know
I just don't know what's going to happen.
But, whatever happened 5,200 years ago, or when it was, is it 3113 BC or something?
What can happen?
It was good.
What can happen to back up your theories? What's out there?
What, in terms of Planet X?
Scientists doing that, yeah.
There are a lot of scientists who are very interested in this subject, and they tend to keep their papers fairly low-key on this subject, I think it would be fair to say. But, in recent times, more public comment has come out that, people throw this idea about this brown dwarf out. The Japanese are well into it. They've been putting together some kind of telescopic search, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if the first people to find it would be the Japs, because they seem really into this subject.
That would revolutionize astronomy. You know that, Andy.
I'm with you on that. I mean, I have to say, George, if they find it, there won't be any credit for little old me. I mean, I'm just one of a number of people.
We'll help give you credit.
Bless you. But really, the person who's going to make their name in history will be the astronomer who finds it. And I have to say to you guys, do it.
And do you think anybody would say, hey, does anyone remember Zachariah Sitchin or Andy Lloyd?
Exactly. They might do. But really speaking, the astronomers have got it all to play for, because history remembers the guy who found the thing.
Right.
So,
and they'll they'll name it after him.
Yeah, exactly. So there's everything to play for them. There's really, really a tremendous possibility of becoming extremely famous as an astronomer, and these guys should get out there and get working on it instead of doing whatever it is they do. But there are a number of camps. There's Mike Brown's camp, who he was quoted once. So he looks for a lot of these Kuiper Belt objects, and he was quoted once as saying, "It's now only a matter of time before something is going to be discovered out there that will change our entire view of the outer solar system." Yes, quite. And Alan Stern, astronomer at Southwest Research Institute at Boulder, is quoted as saying, "The evidence for Planet X is compelling." Compelling? That's really strong there, isn't it? I mean, I agree with him. It is compelling. Then I've got Callas and Graham, who are astronomers in California. The shape of the Kuiper Belt has Callas thinking that the Sun might also have a companion that keeps the Kuiper Belt confined within a sharp boundary. So those are just a few little snippets of some of the astronomers who are contemporary with us, who are taking this kind of idea seriously. And in the next few years, there are going to be a number of sky searches in the infrared that go up, on rockets mostly, to go into orbit, and they are going to provide the answers, to be honest with you.
Well, and what you bring to the table, Andy, is a perspective that I hadn't thought about before. And yes, we've heard about the binary star system, the possibility that our sun had a twin that was burned out, for example. What you bring is the moon theory, which Nibiru, you claim, is a moon. That's novel, and that also explains the heat source, the fact that this planet, this moon, could go so far out and still be able to keep inhabitable creatures on it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I remember from, we go back to Cosmos, and I used to watch Cosmos and Voyager, and there were all these fantastic discoveries. And, of course, what we all wanted to hear was they discover life, they find water, they find habitable planet in the solar system. And one of the dreadful things that happened to planetary science in the 70s was that Voyager kind of killed it. You had the moon landings, and they were sending all these probes out, and we had this wonderful idea that the solar system might be teeming with life, and it might be really exciting, and everything was just a dead rock. And people lost interest, frankly. I mean, that's what went wrong with the whole thing. People lost interest because they wanted to find out about life. And, okay, we found areas in the solar system where there is some frozen water, and, you might have some microbes, and maybe Europa's got some life in its ocean.
We want to find people.
Exactly. Yeah. But this idea, this brown dwarf and its moon, totally takes us back to where we were in the early 70s.
It really does. I like it. Andy, stay with us. On our last hour, what we do is open up the phone lines, so we shall do that with you and give people an opportunity to talk with you. We'll be back.